The 911 call, I would later learn from the discovery documents in the ensuing lawsuit, was a masterpiece of hysterical, suburban terror. The voice on the recording belonged to Margaret Jennings, the president of the Whispering Woods Homeowners Association, and it was a high-pitched, panicked whisper, delivered with the breathless urgency of someone who has just witnessed an unspeakable, Lovecraftian horror. "Yes, my name is Margaret Jennings. I live at 112 Vista Ridge Drive," she had gasped to the dispatcher, her voice trembling. "I'm looking out my back window, across the ravine at the old Clayton cabin. My neighbor, the reclusive man who lives there, he's in his backyard with a body, a real one. He's laying out a skeleton on a tarp. Oh my God. I think he's a serial killer. He's arranging the bones, touching the skull. Please send someone quickly, before he buries it again." Down in the quiet, sun-dappled ravine, in the secluded yard of my cabin, I was completely oblivious to a storm of sirens and flashing lights that was about to descend upon my carefully ordered world. I was, as she had so accurately, yet so profoundly and ignorantly observed, arranging a skeleton. "All right, old friend," I murmured, my voice a soft, respectful whisper that was lost in the gentle sighing rustle of the pine trees. "Let's see what story you have to tell us? It's been a long time coming." I knelt on the large canvas tarp, my movements slow and methodical. A surgeon's precision applied to the archaeology of a forgotten crime. The bones laid out before me were fragile, stained the deep, rich color of the earth from the 30 years they had spent in a shallow, unmarked grave in the northern part of the state. This was John Doe 7B. A cold case delivered to me just this morning from the State Bureau of Investigation. My job as a forensic anthropologist was to give him back his name, and if I was very, very lucky, to find the faint, silent clues etched into his bones that might finally point to the person who had put him there 3 decades ago. My cabin was not just my home. It was my laboratory. I had bought the old isolated property for its profound silence and its unique north-facing yard, which offered the perfect, diffuse natural light needed for the delicate and often grim work of skeletal analysis. After years of working in sterile, windowless university basements under the harsh, unforgiving glare of fluorescent lights, the chance to do my work in the open air, surrounded by the quiet dignity of the forest, was a gift. The county had agreed, and after a lengthy public hearing, had granted me the special use permit required to operate my forensic consultancy from my home. This piece, however, had been under constant siege since the day Margaret Jennings and her husband had moved into the massive glass-walled mansion on the ridge opposite mine, a new addition to the ever-expanding Whispering Woods development. My property was a private, sovereign island, legally exempt from their HOA, a fact that Margaret seemed to find personally and deeply offensive. She was a woman who had appointed herself the chief intelligence officer of her community. She was a researcher, a fact, she announced with pride at community meetings. This meant she spent her days scouring social media, running superficial background checks, and generally peering into the lives of her neighbors through a pair of powerful binoculars, all under the guise of maintaining community security. She had researched me, of course, but her research was lazy, colored by her own paranoid and feverish imagination. She had discovered that I was a single man, a doctor, though of what kind, she hadn't bothered to learn, who'd kept to himself and worked from home. From these few simple facts, she had constructed a lurid narrative in which I was a weirdo, a recluse, and therefore a probable threat to her idyllic world. Her campaign of harassment had been a slow, steady drip of petty complaints designed to probe my defenses. She'd filed a formal grievance with the county about the unkept and hazardous nature of my wooded yard, which I kept deliberately natural to study decomposition rates on animal remains for the State Forestry Service. She had complained to the EPA about a persistent and noxious chemical smell, which was the harmless archival-grade acrylic polymer I used to stabilize and preserve fragile, ancient bones. At each complaint had been investigated by a weary county official and summarily dismissed. Each dismissal had only deepened her conviction that I was a sinister figure, a criminal mastermind cleverly covering his tracks. The truth of my work was, in fact, laid out in a thick, detailed public document down at the county planning office. The file for my special use permit file Hashtag Z-44B-1 contained my full credentials. My curriculum vitae, my current contracts with the state, and a full non-graphic description of the nature of my work. Margaret, as an adjacent property owner, had been sent a certified letter notifying her of the public zoning hearing for that permit over a year ago. She had likely tossed the notice in the trash, deeming it bureaucratic junk mail, never bothering to read the one document that would have explained everything. She was a researcher who couldn't be bothered to do the actual research. Now, my work. The quiet, somber communion with the dead was about to be interrupted by the loud, chaotic consequences of her willful and spectacular ignorance. I was examining the hyoid bone, a tiny U-shaped bone from the neck that is often broken during manual strangulation. I was holding it up to the light, looking for the telltale signs of a fracture, when the sound of sirens, distant at first, then growing terrifyingly, impossibly close, shattered the forest's peace. I stood up, my heart pounding with a sudden, confused alarm. The sirens were coming up my long, private driveway. I saw the first patrol car break through the trees, then a second and a third. They screeched to a halt in my gravel parking area, doors flying open, officers emerging with their weapons drawn, using their cars as cover in a practiced tactical formation. Freeze. Hands in the air, get on the ground now, a voice boomed through a megaphone. The sound distorted and monstrous as it echoed off the trees and the quiet waters of the lake. I raised my hand slowly, my mind reeling, trying to process the impossible situation. What in God's name was happening? I looked down at the scene from their perspective, and a wave of cold dread washed over me. A secluded cabin in the deep woods. A man standing over a complete human skeleton, laid out carefully on a tarp. It was a scene straight out of a horror movie, a tableau of guilt. My professional scientific workspace had suddenly become a horrifying, damning crime scene. On the ridge opposite, I could see her. Margaret Jennings was standing on her deck, her binoculars still raised to her eyes, a look of triumphant, vindicated righteousness on her face. She had finally caught the monster in the woods. She had no idea she'd just made the biggest and most legally consequential mistake of her life. I complied immediately, my own training in crime scene protocol and de-escalation kicking in. I lowered myself slowly to the ground, my hands behind my head, my face pressed into the cool, damp earth of my own backyard. The officers, moving with the practiced efficiency of a well-drilled team, advanced on the scene, their weapons still trained on me. The air was thick with tension, a dangerous cocktail of high-stakes police work and a profound, central misunderstanding that could easily turn tragic. "Sir, do not move a muscle," the lead officer, a tall, grim-faced sergeant, commanded as he approached, his boots crunching on the fallen leaves. His eyes were fixed on the skeleton laid out on the tarp, his expression a mixture of professional caution and raw human horror. "I'm not moving," I said, my voice as calm and clear as I could make it, my words slightly muffled by the ground. "My name is Dr. Elias Vance. I am a forensic anthropologist. The remains on that tarp are designated as John Doe 7B, an active cold case under the jurisdiction of the State Bureau of Investigation. I am under contract with them to perform this analysis." My words seemed to hang in the air, a statement so bizarre and unexpected that it momentarily broke their momentum. The sergeant signaled to his men, who kept their weapons on me, but didn't advance further. He was processing, evaluating Dr. Vance. Another voice called out, this one more familiar, cutting through the tension. A man in a detective suit was now walking onto the scene, his own weapon holstered, his face a mask of weary disbelief. It was Detective Dave Miller, a man I had worked with on a particularly grim case up in Dawson County a few years back. He looked at me, lying face down in the dirt, then at the skeleton, and then up at the ridge, where he could just make out the figure of Margaret Jennings watching the drama unfold. A look of weary, dawning comprehension crossed his face. "Elias?" he said, his voice a mixture of disbelief and profound annoyance. "Last time I saw you, you were pulling bone fragments out of a burn barrel. What have you gotten yourself into now?" "That's what I'd like to know, Dave," I replied. "Yes. I was working, and suddenly your colleagues arrived with the apparent intention of auditioning for a new season of a cop show? Miller sighed, a long, suffering sound, and motioned for the officers to lower their weapons. "All right, let him up," he said. He then spoke into his radio. "Be advised, the situation is not as reported. It's a 1099, false alarm. Stand by." As I got to my feet, brushing the dirt and leaves from my clothes, the county sheriff's car came rolling up the driveway. Sheriff Thompson himself got out, his face a thundercloud. He had clearly been called in due to the potential of a homicide. Seen on his turf? "Miller, what in the Sam Hill is going on?" the sheriff boomed. "My dispatcher had a woman on the line, claiming she was watching a murder scene in progress, said something about a serial killer." "It's a false alarm, Sheriff," Miller said, gesturing to me. "This is Dr. Vance, the SBI's cold case guy from the university. The body is his homework." The sheriff's eyes widened in recognition as he looked at me. "Dr. Vance, I am so sorry. I had no idea it was you. My apologies for the aggressive response." He then looked up at the house on the ridge, and his expression hardened into a mask of cold fury. "So the 911 call came from the new place? From the HOA president, Margaret Jennings?" "It appears so," I said, a cold anger now beginning to replace my shock. "Right," the sheriff said, a note of finality in his voice. He turned to Miller. "Dave, you stay here, secure the scene, and get Dr. Vance's full statement for the report." "Aye," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "I'm going to go have a little chat with the complainant." What followed was a slow, beautiful, and utterly devastating legal dismantling. While Miller took my statement, and I showed him the official, sealed SBI case file for John Doe 7B that I kept in my cabin's office. Sheriff Thompson and 2 of his deputies drove up the winding road to Margaret's mansion. The sheriff, I was told later by a deputy who witnessed it with unconcealed glee, was a masterpiece of controlled, righteous fury. He walked onto her expansive deck, where she was waiting with a triumphant smile. His first words were, "Ma'am, I'm Sheriff Thompson. You're going to come with me. You have some very serious questions to answer down at the station." He then proceeded to explain to her, in excruciatingly clear and simple terms, who I was. He explained that the body she had so hysterically reported was, in fact, crucial evidence in a 30-year-old murder investigation of a missing child. He explained that my cabin was a legally permitted, county-approved forensic facility under direct contract with the state of Georgia. He explained that her hysterical 911 call had triggered a massive and expensive multi-jurisdictional police response, diverting resources from actual emergencies. And he explained that, by doing so, she had committed the very serious crime of knowingly filing a false police report and, more gravely, of criminally interfering with an active homicide investigation. And then he delivered the final, crushing blow. The question that turned her from a concerned, albeit mistaken, citizen into a reckless, negligent fool. "Ma'am," the sheriff asked, his voice deceptively calm, "as president of your HOA, you obviously pride yourself on knowing the rules and regulations of your community. Before you made this call, did you do any of your famous research? Did you, for instance, ever bother to go down to the county planning office and read the public file on Dr. Vance's property permit? The file that explains in great detail the exact nature of his work. The file for the public zoning hearing that, as an adjacent property owner, you were legally notified of by certified mail over a year ago." That was the moment. The question from the title that had been hanging in the air? Her face, the deputy told me, froze. The color drained from it. The realization that the truth had been available to her all along. That this entire humiliating disaster was a direct result of her own arrogant laziness and her refusal to read her mail. Hit her with the force of a physical blow. She had been so sure of her own sinister narrative that she had never bothered to check the simple, boring, publicly available facts. She hadn't read my file. Margaret Jennings was arrested and charged with filing a false police report and obstruction of justice. The news of her arrest and the bizarre, macabre details of the story sent shockwaves through the Whispering Woods community. She was immediately and unceremoniously removed as president. her reign of paranoid terror brought to a sudden and ignominious end. A few days later, the quiet had returned to my woods. The police were gone. The only sound was the rustling of the wind. I was back in my yard with the bones of John Doe 7B. Margaret's foolishness, however, had had an unintended and powerful consequence. Her sensational 911 call had drawn media attention, which in turn had put a massive new spotlight on the old, forgotten cold case. The SBI had poured new resources into the investigation, spurred by the public interest. I knelt down again, my focus renewed, picking up a small, fragile piece of the victim's ribcage. And that's when I saw it. Tiny, almost invisible, healed fracture line. Something I had missed in my initial survey under the lab lights. A defensive wound, perhaps, from an earlier assault. A detail that had been hidden in the shadows now, brought into the light by the very chaos that had threatened to derail my work. I looked up at Margaret's house on the ridge. It was dark and silent, its owner now tangled in a legal mess of her own making. She had tried to cast me as a monster, a villain in her suburban drama. But in the end, her hysteria had only helped me get one step closer to finding the real monster, the one who had left a child in a shallow grave 30 years ago. I had not just defended my home and my profession because of her ignorant call. I was now closer than ever to giving my silent, patient friend his name back.